we're being respectful of everybody's time. So welcome. Good evening, everybody. My name is Melissa Marquis. I work for the West Hartford Bloomfield Health District as their emergency response specialist. I am a nurse as well, so I come with a varied background, lots of different experience over the years, even though I look like I'm 12. I'm not. I get that a lot. So we want to talk to you tonight about how you guys can be more personally prepared to withstand and deal with emergencies that may happen, much like COVID, some of the severe weather events that we've had in the past years. So just give you some practical tips to help manage. So we'll go through a couple of different objectives here. The first, we'll talk a little bit about what public health in Connecticut looks like. And then we'll go through some of the sort of principal concepts of what public health emergency preparedness is. And then I'm going to talk just a little bit about some of the different roles and responsibilities the health department has in responding to emergencies. And then lastly, we'll touch more on that personal preparedness. And that'll be probably more the bulk of the presentation, but that's going to come at the latter half. So what I'd like, if you have your cell phones, if you can just mute them just in case they do ring, that it's not being picked up on the live feed. And then if you can hold your questions to the end. So we'll get through everything. We do have a hard stop right at 7. So we'll try to get through everything and allow plenty of time for some questions for you guys as needed. So just kind of diving into what health departments in Connecticut look like. So we have Connecticut, you know, does not have a county government structure, so it's all locally governed, locally controlled. So every town has to have a health department, and that might look like a part-time health department that is, you know, has maybe it could be a full-time health director or even a part-time health director, and maybe one sanitarian to do the restaurant inspections and the food establishment inspections. And then it might range all the way up to having a municipal full-time department. So that would be one health department with numerous staff taking care of one municipality, like Hartford, New Britain, some of those towns. And then you'll have these health districts, which is what we are in West Hartford Bloomfield, where it's a collection of towns. So it can serve anywhere from 2 to 19 different towns. So essentially every resident in Connecticut has to be serviced by the health department by state law. And so we have in Connecticut 60 different health departments. Most of those, about 54 of them, are full-time. And so that's a range between the districts and the municipal departments. Okay. And then there's 2 tribal health departments as well for the 2 tribes. So that's the red dots there on the map. So all the yellow on the map there, those just represent the health districts. No, excuse me, the municipal departments. The health districts are all the blue. So you can see that we have more numbers of full-time municipal departments, but the vast majority of the state is covered by district, just because we have a lot of rural towns here, so that's why, predominantly. So kind of narrowing down to us, so West Hartford and Bloomfield, we, as I said, are your health department. So we provide lots of different services, and we have a great little brochure that discusses and talks about the different types of services we offer. But again, ranges anywhere from food service establishment inspections, regulatory requirements that we have to make sure that all of those food establishments are safe, that they're providing good quality food, that you're not going to get sick eating there. And they do salon inspections. Have a seat. Salon inspections, daycare inspections, lots of different regulations and inspections. And then we offer vaccinations as well in our health department. Not every health department does offer that, but we do have certain services for pediatric and adult immunizations. So if you are in need, we've got a flyer up there as well, so take a look at what we offer. We do have about 84,000 residents between the 2 towns, so it's pretty substantial in terms of our community size. And the demographics range a lot, so we've got a good mix of both pediatrics, young children, all the way through seniors. We have a lot of long-term care facilities, assisted living facilities in our jurisdictions. So we have definitely a lot of varied interest groups that we need to be mindful of. So what do we actually do? I gave you a couple of the activities that we do, but really it comes down to, we call it the 3 Ps. So it's all about preventing, promoting, and protecting. And so we're looking to prevent disease outbreaks, premature death, so a lot of that is that more preventative health care. So preventative vaccinations for diseases that can be managed or cured or prevented entirely by vaccinations. Again, monitoring for disease outbreaks and implementing certain strategies so that we can stop them before they become larger. We promote certain policies and practices that would encourage healthy behaviors, healthy lifestyles, and therefore a healthy community. So that's a lot of our job. And then we protect against emergencies, and again, those disease outbreaks of a more infectious nature. So we definitely have a lot of different services that we offer. We work with a lot of town partners like police, fire, emergency medical services. I said long-term care facilities, we have a lot of those, so we do partner and do a lot of work with them, primarily on reducing and eliminating healthcare associated infections, making sure that their staff are trained effectively, they know what to do in case of an outbreak, and hopefully we can stop it before it spreads, because it is a very vulnerable group that we want to try to help protect. You know, we work with social services, other health departments, so we've got a pretty broad network of partners that we all work to get this work done. So those 3 Ps. So in terms of emergencies, you know, like I said, a lot of our public health activities and the programs that I just discussed are focused more on the prevention of illness and disease outbreak. And so a lot of that does tie in nicely with public health preparedness. You'll see on this slide, this is kind of broken out into a couple of different areas or categories of which we have to plan and prepare for. So a lot of my job is to work with our town agencies. So West Hartford Office of Emergency Management, we work with them, with the fire department, the police department particularly, on identifying what our threats and hazards are for the community. What are the top things that are likely to happen, and of those, which are likely to have a high impact on the community. And so we work hard to address those impacts and hopefully prevent them by having plans and procedures in place ahead of time, so that, you know, when a hurricane does come, obviously we're not strong enough to stop a hurricane. We don't have that power. Wish we did sometimes, but we don't. We need to have some procedures in place so that we know what our individual local roles and responsibilities are when it comes time to dealing with the aftermath of a disaster. So looking at flooding, looking at power outages, setting up shelters as needed. So those are the types of things that we're going to look at. So we kind of categorize these into a few different buckets. So we've got those intentional emergencies that are likely to happen, and those are more terrorism-related events. So you think to 9/11, obviously, as the biggest one that has the greatest, potentially has a very large impact. And so there's different categories of those, so chemical, biological, radiological, et cetera. And then you may have some man-made events, which could include mass casualty types of events. So it could be maybe an intentionally set fire in a large apartment building or a warehouse where, you know, there's a large amount of people all in this one location. You know, could be anything more than 50 to 100 people. That would be considered a mass casualty event. Small scale, you know, in the grand scheme of things, but still something that we need to be aware of and working with our partners to plan for. And then we've got those naturally occurring emergencies. And I think that's predominantly where most of the emergencies, if we're going to face something, that's really where it's going to fall. And so if you think back historically, we've had disease outbreaks. We've had a lot of severe weather with long-term power outages. We've had some mass casualty on small scales. There was an incident at Bradley Airport a few years ago. Small scale, this is just a small number of people, but had a high impact there within that community. So those are some of the different types of things that we're looking at. And so being prepared really is an integral part of being a responsible citizen of the community. And so that's why you're here. So we're grateful for that. And hopefully you get some good tips out of this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the specific emergencies that we plan for, some of those more either high impact or have a high potential of occurring emergencies. So one of these would be infectious disease outbreaks. And obviously, well, it's been over 3 years now. It's going on 4 years since COVID started. Can you believe it's been that long? It feels like yesterday, but it, for me, feels like it's been 18 years. So we have to really look at that. And it's preparing for not just a pandemic, not just a bad respiratory season with flu or RSV or other respiratory diseases, but we have to be prepared for things that don't happen but could have a high impact, like Ebola. Thankfully, Ebola is not something that happens here, but we had that scary potential. Anytime you introduce planes and people traveling, you have a potential to bring disease anywhere. And so that's critical, especially when we're living in this 21st mobile century where everybody's going. So we look at how do we prevent epidemics and both pandemics. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the distinction between those two. So epidemic really is an isolated outbreak of a specific illness, infectious disease, and it would be isolated to, it could be a single person in the case of like measles, because that's one of the most contagious illness there is, and so it's highly transmissible, and so we won't really, anytime we identify a single case, we put the stops on it very quickly. You could have an isolated outbreak within a small community, a neighborhood or a classroom or a wing at a long-term care facility, or it could be in a broader geographic area but hasn't extended outside of those borders. So we look at, a good example would be these smaller, in quotes, Ebola outbreaks. We had the bigger one in 2014, 2015 that had the potential to bring patients to the US and other countries for care. There was one individual that flew to Dallas, and it was identified that he was sick. He didn't know he was sick, or maybe there was some misinformation about that. But anyway, he made it to the US and he got sick here. And so that was a big public health concern. Ebola is contagious. Yes?
Two questions. RSV, do you not, over 65, do you not? I'm curious what the department recommends.
For vaccination, you mean?
Yeah. And my other question has to do with malaria and incidents. Do you see a lot of it, or do you see it in certain countries?
So in terms of RSV, the question was what public health recommends in terms of vaccination. So there are brand new vaccines that have just recently come out and are available. They are primarily targeted to small children, infants to early toddler years, because those are the predominant age group that gets affected by RSV. And then, yes, individuals over 65 certainly are recommended, especially if you're going to be around infants, so grandchildren particularly. But, as an aging population, you are a little bit more susceptible to severe infections that somebody younger might be able to, their immune system is a little bit stronger and they might be able to fight that off. So it's a conversation to have with your doctor to find out really what your risk group is. Are you around children? Do you have a compromised medical system as it is? So those are the types of things that you'll want to ask about. And in regards to malaria, what's the prevalence here, I think was the question. It's not a significant issue here. You may have heard earlier this summer that a few cases have popped up in the US, primarily down south though. That particular mosquito is a southern bred mosquito, so it likes that warmer climate. It's obviously quite popular in Africa, in African countries where it's very hot, and so it doesn't live well up here. So it's not a particular concern, although we are watching it. Much like all the other, we call it zoonotic illnesses that have that potential, like the Zika virus that's caused by another mosquito that isn't common up here, but it does have that potential. And especially if you, let's say, you're a snowbird. Let's say you go and spend 6 months of the year down in Florida, you still would potentially have the potential, I guess, to become infected if you got bit by a particular mosquito that's not found up here. So any mosquitoes, any ticks, all of those insects may have the potential to carry viruses. So it's, yeah. So let me just shift gears real quick here. So I talked about the epidemic. A pandemic, just for clarification, is essentially an outbreak of a novel virus. So it's got to be brand new, something that hasn't been seen, that the public doesn't have any immunity to. It needs to be a highly transmissible virus, so meaning it's got to be easily spread from person to person. And then we want to really institute measures that can stop that as quick as possible so that we're preventing wide-scale infections. And so obviously we've been living through a pandemic. We've only had a few pandemics in this century. The 1958 influenza, this wasn't the Spanish flu, it was the one after that. Very few people are probably still alive that survived the Spanish, yeah, but I'm thinking even back the Spanish flu there, that was 1918, yes, thank you. I was going to say 21, I was like, no, that's not right. But we've had the 1957-58 outbreak, and then we had H1N1 that occurred in 2009, 2010. Thankfully, that was a milder virus, caused some infections and some issues, but overall mild. And then obviously COVID. So pandemics can occur in other viruses aside from influenza. So it's like we're seeing with COVID. COVID's a coronavirus, it's not an influenza virus. So really any virus that has that potential to infect a lot of people is easily transmissible, and where there's no community immunity. So basically just kind of talked through that. Let's see if there's anything else I wanted to say here. Yeah, no. So in terms of what are our tools in our sort of public health toolbox specific to dealing with infectious diseases, and it doesn't necessarily have to be only to a pandemic, but this slide is geared a little more towards it. Vaccination, first and foremost, is the most effective tool that we have in terms of reducing infections, reducing duration of infections, and reducing the transmissibility of that infection. The challenge is mass producing very large quantities of that vaccine takes time. It takes time to identify a candidate vaccine. It takes time to test that vaccine on a lot of people and determine the results, analyze the results, and then mass produce it. So it really can take anywhere from typically 4 to 6 months once the vaccine is actually identified as a candidate and trials have begun. But once, it could take when you're looking at it from a little broader perspective, from the time the pandemic starts to whence vaccine is first available, it could be sometime over a year. So if you think back just to a few years ago when COVID first began, we were obviously waiting for a vaccine, and so a lot of the public health actions that were implemented at the time were the rest of this slide. So things like monitoring for surveillance. So what does that mean? It means we're looking at doctor's offices, we're looking at pharmacies, we're looking at hospital admissions. We're trying to get that ground level data of who's getting sick.
Are you doing the wastewater?
We are, yep, not us particularly. Oops, sorry, hitting the mic. Not us particularly, but the state is. There are some different wastewater sites. And to my knowledge, I know it's for COVID. I don't know off the top of my head how many other viruses or infectious diseases they may be able to be monitoring for at any given time.
So it's not necessarily at every town or community water facility?
No, I think right now in Connecticut, I think it's more focused in large urban centers where there's a bigger population group because that's going to give you more data and more data points. So particularly around, like, I think when they first set it up, I think it was around the Yale campuses. Large amounts of people there, heavily dense population. But it is still an active tool that we're using to analyze that. So some of the other measures, and these are hotly contestable measures, and nobody liked doing them, but they are effective. So staying home when you're sick, isolating yourself from other people so that you don't get them sick, quarantining. So you're healthy, but you haven't gotten sick, but you were exposed to somebody who was, or you lived with somebody who was. That was really challenging. When I had to do a lot of contact tracing phone calls with residents in towns that were sick and, trying to explain the purpose behind all of these measures that we were putting into place. And, a lot of people, I think, were anxious over it and, concerned about not being able to go to work, not being able to bring the kids to school, or having to stay out of school for a prolonged period of time. There was definitely a lot of challenges that come with that. But you have to keep in mind that we're doing these measures for the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. It's not meant to, what's the word I'm looking for, isolate you specifically and punish you. It's not a punitive action. It's something to help protect the broader public. And so I think it's important for residents to keep that in mind. So there may be potentials, hang on one second, there may be potentials where we, depending on what COVID does in the future or other viruses, other infectious diseases that may come, there may be potentials where while we're waiting for some kind of therapeutic option to become available, that's the best thing to do, is to ask people to stay home, to work from home, to close schools for a temporary period of time. We've got a lot of technologies that were brought in during COVID that made that possible. It wasn't pleasant. I recognize that myself. But it does help to reduce the overall burden on the community. Go ahead.
I know a couple of people who were trained in the
Contact tracing.
tracing, but it didn't seem to last long, and they were never deployed to do anything with it. Was it successful? Has there been more community involvement?
That's a tough question. Yes, it was successful.
Is this still going on?
In some specific areas, it is. Primarily in congregate living settings, like long-term care facilities, where you have a more vulnerable group of people that you want to make sure is any infection is identified early, and measures are put into place to limit it. So that's contact tracing is most effective in those small groups of cases where you really have control over movement of people. When there's so much community spread that's happening, it's less effective, in my opinion. But it is a tool, and a lot of these tools on their own are not going to work. When you layer them together, that's where you're going to get the greatest potential. And then once you get vaccine into it, that's really going to help reduce both disease burden, transmission, and all of those. And we saw that with COVID.
Was there a good amount of community involvement or training, or was that lacking?
Yes, in terms of, when we are actually doing the interviews with residents, there's a lot of education that takes place between us and that person. The onus then gets put onto that resident to follow through. We can't mandate that you have to stay home. because you're sick or you're quarantined. We're requesting it out of the goodness of your heart and the health and safety of others around you.
I think some people came after you asked us to hold our questions. 'Cause
Yeah.
I know I'd like to get
Yep,
to talk.
yep, that's fine. So in terms of these measures, so as I said, layering them all on top of one another is going to be most effective at reducing that overall burden. But as you know, we're almost 4 years into COVID, and we're not done with it. There's still people wearing masks, rightly so. There's still a lot of activities that are being withheld for various reasons. And it's, like I said, it's all about reducing that burden, the disease burden in the community, and trying to protect as many people as possible. So I'm going to kind of transition from the infectious disease to severe weather. So this is another area that we really try to focus a lot on in terms of the health department. As I said earlier, infectious disease and severe weather disasters are probably the more common types of threats that we would face, especially here. So when you're thinking of severe weather, it's not just hurricane season, but it's thinking about heat emergencies. We have these extended periods, weeks on end where it's 90 plus degrees with almost 100% humidity. It's unbearable, and there's a lot of people that don't have air conditioners. So what do you do? Same with severe winter weather. We have to consider blizzards, ice storms, severe cold weather. Oftentimes what we see when we're talking severe weather, whether it's in the winter or in the summer, anything that has the potential to bring trees down on top of wires, long-term power outages, especially over a widespread area. And so that's really our biggest threat that we're trying to address. And so we have to work with our community partners to identify where are there going to be shelters that can be stood up so that they are either a warming center, a cooling center, a charging center, designated hours during the day where you can go for a brief period of time to warm up, to cool down, to charge your devices, maybe get something to eat, light snack, and then go back home. Or there may be overnight shelters where it's just that. You're staying there for maybe days on end, weeks on end, potentially. And we did see that during the couple of major storms that we had just over a decade ago. And so since then, they've done a great amount of work at reducing the amount of trees around power lines. But Connecticut has a very high dense population of trees. And they're beautiful and we love them, but they come at a risk and at a cost. So a couple of really important things to note specific for power outages to allow you to be better prepared at home. We want to make sure that you have certain items available in a close proximity. So flashlights, batteries that are fresh. So maybe replace your batteries a couple of times a year. Make sure that the right size. If you don't have enough of those, you can consider using candles, but obviously that's a potential threat, fire hazard. So you want to make sure that you don't leave those unattended. You're going to want to make sure that you have matches or a lighter as well if you're going to rely on candles. Absolutely, under no circumstances, never bring a propane tank of any sort inside of the house. Whether it's for your grill or for a heating element, do not bring it inside because of the risk for carbon monoxide poisoning. Same with using a generator. Generators have to be used outside of the home, away from the garage, away from doors and windows, because all of that exhaust has to go somewhere. And if it's next to an open window or the open garage or an open door, it's going to emanate through the house. And carbon monoxide is odorless and colorless. You won't know that you've gotten dosed with it until you're sick. And usually that sickness is a headache and fatigue. How many of you have that on a day-to-day basis? Me? So how do you know what's normal versus what's carbon monoxide? And so oftentimes people will say, I'm just going to go lay down for a little bit and sleep it off. That's the worst thing you can do because you lose consciousness. And if somebody isn't in the house with you or they also fall asleep, chances are you're going to die. So it's very, very important to not bring those propane or gas-powered devices inside. The other thing with using a generator, test it a couple times a year. Make sure that it's working. The fuel and the oil can kind of gum up the equipment, and so it may not work when you need it to work. And you'd be really frustrated, and everybody's going to be out trying to buy generators at that point. So save yourself some heartache. And then obviously trying to make sure that you have enough gas and oil on hand. Usually for households, you don't have to run your generator 24/7. I think your neighbors would appreciate it if you didn't. But if you are running it to keep certain elements of your household running, you'll want to make sure that you have, again, enough gas to maintain over a duration, a specific duration. So usually when we're talking about being sort of personally prepared, that includes having this, level of gas on hand, is to be ready for 3 days, at least 3 days of supplies. So if you're going to use a generator and you're going to run it a lot, plan for having enough for 3 days. That'll help reduce the burden at those gas stations. Chances are gas stations are going to be without power. So guess what works on power? Credit card machines. Do you often have cash on hand to pay for your gas? I don't. So a lot of people don't. So you'll want to make sure that you have keep $40 or $100 tucked away somewhere in the house. You forget about it, you're not going to spend it, but it's there just as an emergency, just as a stopgap. If you need to buy food or gas or something and there's no way to actually pay for it, cash is king, they say, right? So keep that in mind. And then obviously the big thing here, probably should have highlighted it since it is a public health measure. When in doubt, throw it out. What's that go for? Food, that's right. So if you're not going to run a generator 24/7 to maintain your fridge and freezer, be prepared to likely have to throw food away. If it's only a couple of hours without power and you don't go in the fridge or your freezer, your food's going to be fine. As long as you don't keep opening and closing that door, you're good for at least a couple hours. Your freezer, you'll probably have a longer period of time, maybe up to 6 hours or so, before it starts to thaw out and bacteria can start to breed. But you really want to make sure that you're paying attention to that time frame. And anything beyond that time, just throw everything away. It's going to be an expensive food bill after the storm, but it's better than being sick, trust me. And then just be a good community member. Check on your neighbors, especially if you do have a generator and you know that your neighbors don't, and especially if it's an elderly or somebody with a family, young family. If you have the ability to bring them in or at least offer them, a place to charge up their phones and offer them a hot meal, that's just the right thing to do. It's the nice thing to do. So be good to your neighbors. And then the other big piece, and we'll talk about it a little bit later as well, is using one of those all-weather radios. They've got cranks on it, so it's hand-powered. Some of them do have solar panels on it as well. They have a flashlight on it, but most importantly, they give you information. It's a wonderful tool. The radio is actually a great tool to use in emergencies because they will be constantly being fed emergency information by the state, by the locals, anybody that's involved in that response. So you'll be constantly getting updates from them. So that's very important. And then the last piece is consider buying like a solar charger or like a power bank for your phones. Everybody lives on their cell phones these days. It's very easy to obtain information on your phone if you have nothing else. No computer, no TV, no internet. Your phone still works, hopefully. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to probably just not spend much time on this one, but just so you know, this came up quite a bit during COVID. It is something that we planned for throughout, but maintaining that we are planning effectively for all of our community, not just sections of the population, not just focusing on those that are more vulnerable, but we want to make sure that we're addressing the needs of everybody as best as possible. And so keeping that sort of health equity framework in mind is important. So I'm not going to spend much time on there because we still have a bit to go through here. I'm going to talk a bit about volunteerism for the next couple of slides because it is important. You know, obviously you guys are interested in learning more about preparedness, more on how to have yourself and your families more prepared. And hopefully, you know, you'll come out of this thinking, well, I wonder how else I can get involved. How else can I be of use and service to my community? Well, this is a great way. So during COVID specifically, since that's the most recent example that we've just all lived through, you'll remember probably when the vaccines first came out, there was a lot of large public clinics to give that vaccine. Each of those clinics that we ran for usually 4 to 6 hours, depending on location and how many people. We needed at least 40 staff members to work that. We have a staff of 16. Where do we get the others? Yeah, exactly. So we rely heavily on you, on the community, to come up and help. And so there was a big push by the governor at the start of COVID. Hey, long event, we need people to help support us all. You know, we all live in communities. We're all amongst one another, so we really need to help each other out. And so the best way to do that is to volunteer. And so some of the things that volunteers would be maybe asked to do are to work at these clinics, maybe to help with managing the lines and just talking to people. Hey, did you fill out your paperwork? Oh, let me help you take your coat off. Or, you know, just talking to people, lower their anxiety. You know, emergencies are always highly stressed. There's always people that are coming in anxious and afraid and unsure of what's next. So the more information we can give to them to help them be prepared, to know what that very next step is, key. And so volunteers are great at that. You know your community. Chances are you're going to know people in line. So it's a great opportunity to help out. As a volunteer, you will always be trained. We're never going to ask you to do a job that you are not either qualified or capable of doing. So if you have physical limitations and you can't stand for long times, we'll give you a job where you're sitting, or vice versa. I don't know, if we need nurses and you're an administrative assistant, okay, we're going to use you at the registration table rather than at the nursing table. You know, so we'll always be able to find a job for somebody to do, and we will train you to what it is that job is going to entail. We'll call that just-in-time training. And so we'll make sure that you get some of that ahead of time to the extent possible. So that's where partnering with, we call them affiliated volunteer groups. So things like you may have heard in West Hartford during COVID, a new group was started up called the Community Emergency Response Team. And it's a volunteer group run by our local emergency management director. And so he just brings in lots of community residents. Viviani in the back is a member of the team, and she's been deployed or just helping out at town events. You know, there's a wide range of things that these volunteers get engaged in. It's a great way to meet people, great way to give back to your community. And then the other volunteer group that we use heavily, and we used a lot specifically during COVID, is a group called the Medical Reserve Corps. And that's a regional group, meaning that they go across the region, across central Connecticut predominantly, to all the other towns and help out. And that's generally staffed with individuals who are medically certified. So who have credentials like a doctor, a nurse practitioner, pharmacist, so a lot of those types of individuals. But anybody can come. You don't have to be medically trained to be there. And so there's certainly a lot of opportunities there. And so if you're interested, let us know. We can give you some information, some resources, and where to go to get more info. But volunteerism is where it's at. So looking at recovery, recovery is an interesting thing, and it's hard to plan for because every emergency has its own timeline. You know, none of them are ever the same. You know, so typically what we like to say is, you know, when I'm planning for emergencies, as soon as the emergency hits, then I'm starting to plan for the recovery and what does that look like. So not only am I trying to respond, but I'm also trying to plan for how do we get the community back to normal or as close to normal as possible. And so it's, for public health events, it's often a very long duration planning process. And it's kind of cyclical, much like everything else. You know, we start to implement some measures that we think are going to help, and then we have to reevaluate them. And then we might have to make some tweaks to certain activities and just see how things are progressing. And so it's just kind of like this life cycle. But we do, like I said, like everything else in planning, we work with all of our partners to make sure that we're all trying to get the community back up and running as fast as possible. And some sections of the community might get sort of normalized more quickly, and that's probably intentional when you're thinking of like the business community, you know, making sure that grocery stores and banks and all of those sort of critical infrastructure businesses that are crucial to our everyday life, make sure that those are up and running, and then start bringing on the other things underneath as quick as possible. All right, so in terms of personal preparedness, this is the last portion of the presentation. So we talked a bit about making sure that you're prepared for at least 72 hours. That's sort of the minimum that we want you to look at. So that includes thinking through the different lists of what do I need to have on hand at home if I had to stay at home for at least 3 days, I couldn't leave. Do I have enough food? Do I have enough water? Is the power going to stay on or no? If not, then how do I cook my food? So again, running through all the list of potential possibilities and thinking through what is it that I might need if X scenario happens. Making sure, again, that you have money on hand, that you've got the right clothing you might need if you have to evacuate. And where are you going to go? And who's going to know that you're going there? How do you communicate if cell phone towers are down? How are you going to communicate if you can't get in touch with anybody and your husband or your wife works in a whole other town and your kids are at school cross town? How do you get everybody together again? So those are some of the things that we ask people to think through to try to identify, you know, all the what-if scenarios and try to be as prepared as possible for that sort of worst-case scenario. And so it really entails 3 different things. Get a kit, make a plan, and be informed. If you do all 3 of those things, you're going to be good. You'll be able to ride the storm pretty well. It's going to be bumpy. There's going to be things that maybe don't work all that well. You might need some help. But chances are, if you stacked yourself up against being prepared and having everything done versus somebody who doesn't have that, chances are you're going to fare better. So we certainly encourage you to think through all this stuff. And so we have a ton of resources over there, and I really encourage you to take one of everything, bring it home, read through it all. Some of them are little workbooks. Most of them are just quick fact sheets on a variety of topics. There is a booklet at the right end of the table there. Got a couple of different languages there, but that entails a lot of this. So what to have in basically a bag. We call them a go bag. So if you had to leave the house quick or an emergency happened and you got to go somewhere, you have to stay home, do you have stuff there in place ready to help you weather through the next at least 3 days? And so these are some of those items. And again, like I said, a lot of that is already detailed over there, so I'm not going to spend much time on that. The one thing I will say is because we live in New England, we are certainly no stranger to winter weather. Winter weather brings a whole added level of potential risk, especially if you're driving. And so we definitely encourage you to have a smaller one of these kits in your car and make it winter ready. So have a blanket in there, have a pair of boots and an extra pair of socks. Consider maybe putting a small shovel in a bag of cat litter. That way if you were to get stuck in a snowbank and you couldn't get out, you don't have snow tires, you know, they're not studded and there's nobody else to help push you out, you can try to dig out a little bit, put some cat litter underneath to give your tire some traction, and you might be able to rock your car out and get back on the road. If not, then hopefully the blanket will help to keep you warm until the, you know, hopefully you can keep the car running and the heat on until the gas runs out or help comes. But, you know, those are just some practical tips to try to keep you as safe as possible. And that's where having that, I mentioned having like a solar pack or a power bank for your cell phone. If you keep that with you and you get stuck in a car and your battery's dead and you can't charge anything and your phone's going to die, having that as an alternate source of power is important as well. So in terms of making a plan, we talked a bit about that communications plan. I said it's really important, especially if you live with several other individuals in your family and they're all scattered around. Do you know exactly where you're going to go if you have to evacuate? Does everybody know where they're going to go? Can you all go to the same place? So as a family, think about where's a good location that everybody knows how to get to and can get to in town, and then also another place outside of town. So a further location away, hopefully away from the emergency. So typically that might look like going outside of the state lines. So if you have relatives in New York or Massachusetts or Rhode Island, those are great further away locations that you can still easily get to, or hopefully easily get to. And then likewise, having a shelter-in-place plan. You know, okay, well, now we all have to stay home because COVID's come back and it's terrible and we can't really go out and do anything. So we're all just going to stay home, hunker down, or it's a really bad blizzard, same thing. You know, what are we going to do? How are we making sure that we have all the things that we need at home to withstand the next couple of days? And then test those contacts. You know, big thing is with cell phones these days, nobody knows phone numbers anymore, right? Your battery dies. Oh shoot! Now you're up the creek because you don't know who to contact because you don't know anybody's number. Print it out every once in a while. Go through your contacts and just print them out, or at least the ones that are most important to you, especially if any of those numbers are going to be in your evacuation plan, and make sure that kids know your cell phone number by heart, those types of things. So we talked about that one. Yeah, most of this we've already covered here. The one piece that I will say that I didn't really talk about with the volunteering piece, and it ties in a little with this, is if you're going to be a responder, whether it's a volunteer or you work in an agency where you do have some sort of a response role, if you're not personally prepared and your family's not prepared to handle whatever's going to happen while you're gone, I can't rely on you. And so that includes making sure that people know how to get a hold of you if another emergency comes up while you're away. So thinking through, again, those different contacts. Do you have a plan in place for taking care of children, your pets, elderly, loved ones that you help to take care of? Those are all some of the things that you'll need to kind of consider if you're going to volunteer or have some sort of a response role. And so that's all important information. And then the last bit here, I'm going to highlight really just the red parts. So in terms of emergency notifications, the town and the state both have systems in place. They're separate systems that can send out blast notifications to residents, but only if they know about you. So that's where there needs to be some interaction. You need to go to that website to sign up if you don't already receive these notifications. And so I'll leave this up. You can take notes or you can grab a paper over there and write it down. I'm sorry we didn't print these out for you. But those, or you can just Google emergency notification for West Hartford and it'll take you to that page. That might be the easier way to do it. But as I said, West Hartford and the state both have separate notification systems. And they may not always send it to you immediately. You might get one from West Hartford, but not one from the state, or vice versa. So it's kind of a little bit of a crapshoot with that, but you will receive notifications, and they'll tell you what's happening, what you need to do, and sort of what to expect in the short time frame moving forward. So it is definitely important to keep those in mind. Really quickly on this slide, we talked a lot about power outages, but the one thing I didn't mention is, if you own your home, do you know where your utility and emergency shut-off valves are? Especially if you're losing power, if there's a potential for a gas emergency, if you have gas at home, you need to know where those shut-off valves are, and you need to have the right equipment to turn them off. So that's an important thing to investigate. And then always make sure you've got your smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors up and running, batteries changed twice a year. Okay. So that's it with 10 minutes left. Fire away. Go ahead.
So first I have a couple of comments and then a question.
Yeah.
One of the deficits that I see very often, I'm a physician,
Oh, okay.
is people don't stock enough of their prescriptions.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. Very important.
So if you remember the volcano eruption in Iceland 5 years ago, people were stuck on vacation in Europe.
Yep.
They didn't have their medicines. They had no way to get them. So always try to stay ahead of your medication supply.
100%. Thank you for bringing that up.
If your pharmacy provider type, whoever you're enrolled with, will let you get extra.
Well, you can if you go on vacation. You can petition to get an
Right,
extra
but
supply.
for just extra, you gotta almost squirrel away extras all year till you have about 30 days worth of extra.
There are some ways around that, and in an emergency, pharmacies are more lenient and will give you an emergency 3-day supply. But chances are you may not get that ahead of time,
If
though.
the pharmacies are still open.
Yes, exactly. It's not a great preemptive
The
thing.
second suggestion is to always have a plan with your family about phone contacts. You mentioned that, but
Yeah.
I think that a lot of people don't do that.
Correct.
And the third minor thing, but usually forgotten, is stay up to date on your tetanus vaccinations.
Yeah.
Because in an emergency, if the health system is swamped, you're not going to be able to get one, and then if you get a cut or step on a nail.
And that's what, every 10 years, right? Is that still recommended?
Yes. And the question I have is, do we have in West Hartford, Bloomfield, a census of impaired people?
We do, thank you. Yes, I meant to bring that up. So the fire department typically, either between fire or the Office of Emergency Management, usually they have a list. I can't tell you how updated it is because, as you know as a physician, it is a fluid list. Any one of us can become incapacitated to some degree or another on any given day. If you know somebody, or you live with somebody, or you yourselves need and are dependent on electricity for specific breathing machines, medications that need to be in the refrigerator, things that are of life-giving support, definitely reach out to the fire department and ask them to be placed on their emergency list. What that does is it allows the ability, hopefully, can't guarantee it, but they will try to restore power. They'll try to prioritize locations that need power at a faster rate. Again, can't guarantee that that's going to happen, and I don't know the time frame. That's an Eversource question. But if they can't restore power, they can at least relocate you and move you to a shelter where we can provide those services to keep you safe. So thank you very much for bringing that up. Yes, sir.
One other comment. I thought about this a lot some years ago, and got a go kit in the garage.
Yeah.
Got my important documents here and the meds there. And devil's in the details, because in an emergency, I'll forget something.
Right.
I have a list. Go to the front closet and get this. Go to,
Good.
Otherwise.
Yes, no, that's very important, because you're right. You're so focused on, oh my gosh, what just happened, and how do I keep myself safe? You're not necessarily the part of your brain that controls that rational thinking isn't working well. And so you're just kind of on that fight or flight type of response. So having those checklists available in clear locations, by the door, by the refrigerator, near the phone, very key. So thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Are you guys giving COVID yet, the COVID vaccination?
We just received some in the office. I think we're going to be starting to open up for public vaccinations early October. We're just waiting on some finalized documents with our standing orders and such. It is by appointment only. We're not doing large in-person clinics, mainly because your insurance is required. So when you call the office to schedule an appointment, they're going to ask you for your insurance card information because we need to verify that your insurance is going to authorize it. Okay.
Sign up on CVS online.
Yep. There's you can go to vaccine. Yeah, you can go to vaccinefinder.gov and find locations if, let's say, you need to travel in the next week or so and you want to get it before you go and we can't provide it. That gives you good options. And if you have no insurance or are underinsured, the government has provided a program. It's called a Bridge Access Program that it will be free of no charge, no cost to you, as long as you fit in that category, underinsured or not insured. But only select locations in the state are doing that. And so that's where that vaccinefinder.gov is helpful to get that information. Okay. Viv?
I just want to add something. The fire department have a file of life, but you can also find online that we have in the Health District 241. It's basically what he
Yep.
do. You can fill all the information and have a magnet. You can leave in your refrigerator.
Right.
And usually if some emergency happens, they're going to look for that. You also can have in your purse or with you if something happened in the car or you're out, they're going to look for some kind of information to make sure if you have allergic, anything.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it gives you all, you can put in all your medical information on those cards. And just a simple tip for you guys, just not even related to big emergencies, but if you have a smartphone like this, there's programs inside of the phone where you can actually designate like a health card for you, so that you can input all that information, whether what your blood type is, if you know it, what allergies you have. That way, if you're ever, let's say, in a car accident and you're incapacitated, you're unresponsive, if they take your phone and they look to see who your next of kin is, EMS knows to look in the health app to look for that information so that they can get good details about who you are, what's your history. And then the other thing to do, and this can be for any digital phone, is under your contacts, whoever is your in case of emergency person, and I would recommend having 2 at least, to save it as ICE, the word ICE. It stands for in case of emergency. Put that in front of their name so that however your contacts are displayed, that ICE shows up. And so as those emergency responders, if they can get access to your phone and look at your contacts, that's really easy for them to do, and they know once you get to the emergency room, they know who to contact immediately. So just good practical tips for that. So thank you all for coming tonight. We're going to have, this is being recorded, so it will be on the public access TV YouTube channel. So if you want to go back to it, if you missed something or you want to see the slides again or you need those links, go back into that and you'll be able to see that. And we are going to be doing a winter safety class, I think in November probably. So I'll come back and do a little bit. It'll be me and one of my colleagues that's talking about kind of food safety around the holidays and winter weather safety. Go ahead, Viv.
I just want to give you some information. We're going to have next month, that's going to be in the Faxon Library. We're going to be talking about lead and immunization. It's a children's month, so that's towards more to families, and if you have your grandkids around, that's also be really valuable information. Lead, it's a really big problem, especially for house was built before 1978. So we have a ton of houses in our town. We want to make sure everybody be aware of that. Also, we're gonna talk about immunization. In November, we're gonna talk about holiday safety. So time, for Thanksgiving and all the holidays, how everybody feels safe. And we have really good information. Feel free to grab and share with other families or people you may know could be help. We're gonna have some virtual diabetes class. Anybody who is diagnosed with diabetes or have diabetes type 2, we have this program run for years now, really popular. It's totally free. If you're not able to do virtual, you can go in person, the health district, and you're gonna be able to have access to that information. Is a specialist who's gonna do that course. Her name is Paula. She's dietitian and focus on diabetes. So feel free to grab the information. Any questions, our cards on the table too.
Yep.
Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I met you at a certain meeting.
Yes.
months